We are all more than the worst things we have ever done. At that moment, I'd kind of realized that.
I'm Thomas, and this is the Mirror in My Cell. My normalish life was interrupted when some stowaway cannabis of mine reappeared at a Belarusian border checkpoint. The charge would be for 3 to 7 years. I was forced to witness myself and understand the power I do have. Now I want to meet the others who've been changed by incarceration. In this episode, I spoke to Ryan, who lives in the US. Ryan went to prison for a second-degree murder charge. I'm finding this project really interesting because of the breadth of characters I'm meeting, all inspiring in some way, all representing some part of the human experience, what a mess it all is, and what truths transcend that. I can't forget that those things stay true outside of prison. Please enjoy the conversation. Ryan, it's really nice to speak to you finally. As I signed onto the call, you were playing a guitar, a beautiful guitar, and played beautifully. And I guess that's not normally the image that people would have of someone who was in prison for 10 years, basically.
He's hyping this up. None of that is accurate. It was a terrible guitar, played terribly.
But nonetheless, I think it's probably not the type of character you expect to have associated with the labels that you've been carrying around for a little while now, I guess.
I mean, that's fair.
Yeah. So I hope you don't mind me revealing, but you were in prison for around 10 years, right?
6 years.
6 years.
I was sentenced to 10.
Sentenced to 10, in prison for 6, for killing someone, basically.
For a second-degree murder.
Yeah. Do you mind...
Elaborate?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the kind of thing that might need some elaboration. But maybe tell us for a sec who you were before, I think. What age were you and what was happening for you?
Well, at the time, I was 20 years old. I was at the time living in Davenport, Iowa. Here I am doxing myself. But I was living in Davenport, Iowa. And I would say it was not in necessarily the greatest, but I would actually say right now is probably like me at the most positive part of my life. But I was at the opposite of that. A lot of very not good decisions that honestly, in some ways directly and in other ways likely indirectly, led to the events of that night. At the time, I was actually on the, I guess now genuinely back end of moving around a lot. Initially, I'm from Germany, moved to the US when I was 13, was adopted actually. And easiest way to bypass the grief. But I then lived in Virginia until I turned 16. Then I left school and left home for a number of reasons, and moved to DC. I lived in DC, I want to say for about a year and a half. Left DC and actually went back to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Came back, I think, right before I turned 19, maybe right after. I don't remember. Came back to the US, lived with my father for right around 3 months. That went also very not good in a different way, obviously. You could say he and I didn't see eye to eye. I wasn't necessarily a happy person, I suppose. But nothing particularly exciting in a bad way happened. And not long after, something not super exciting, but also a not good thing happened. I split up with my now ex, and I have a weird habit of leaving places in the most drastic way possible. And I basically erased all evidence of my existence from the apartment we lived in. And like I genuinely cleaned hair out of the shower. Yeah. Like I said, I was a very odd person, I guess. And very unhappy person. There was a lot of self-worth stuff, I suppose, that kind of goes into that. I kind of lived a fair portion of my life with the overall mindset of I shouldn't be here, and um, basically going about making it so as though I wasn't, if that makes any sense. Probably not, because it's like the least rational mindset. And I recognize that now. I didn't at the time. Um, for instance, before leaving my grandfather's house, because that's who I was adopted by and lived with, I cut my face out of all of his photographs, which is once again kind of a drastic thing to do. Um, I um, I moved to DC, got a job at a funeral home actually, uh, and did that for about a year and a half. And basically just did like the most drastic version of like the partying mindset, and a lot of that was also due to a complete lack of self-worth. Like I didn't care enough about my life to live it in a way that made me happy, and I recognize now that none of the things I did made me happy. At the time I also didn't care. um Came back to the US and more or less kept up more of the same. After moving in with my father, incidentally, the reason that I left his house too was aside of just a generalized not really seeing eye to eye. At one point, I thought I had a guy over, and he pulled a gun. Actually, yeah,
Oh.
and I know this is going to be like the most American possible thing to say. It wasn't even a good one. It was a Taurus G2C. Like at that
Come on,
point, I
bro.
was
At least
more
pull a
afraid for
good
the lamp
gun.
next to me. And to be frank, that was the right take because he ended up shooting the lamp next to me. Not on purpose. Like, I don't think he was trying to shoot me or the lamp. He's just an idiot. Uh, and also took out two of his own Xbox 360 games. So, scales even out
There is
one
a
way or
God
another.
after all.
Yes, absolutely. He will never play Mass Effect 2
Yeah.
ever again. I did ultimately the same thing. I removed all evidence of my existence from his house, including moving all the furniture that me living there had required to be moved back to where it was before, even vacuumed.
Even vacuumed.
Even vacuumed. And, and I believe the last thing I ever said to him was, "He'll be right back." Ooh,
Well,
yeah, I didn't really stay anywhere in particular. I think I stayed in three hotel rooms for durations of time, but that was pretty much it. Luckily, beforehand, I had made enough money that I didn't necessarily immediately have to worry about working. Um, and I'll be honest, I don't know exactly what kind of job I would have gotten at that point. I keeping in mind that at this point I am functionally homeless. Um, but I was actually at a hotel. There had been a group of people that I just kind of hung out with for like 2 or 3 days, I think. I don't know what I did, said, or really honestly what the hell was this. But they jumped me in the parking lot. And as they were just really giving it to me, I realized that I didn't care then either. Like I just like whatever they did, they did. I didn't try to fight back. I didn't like say anything. Yeah, I just kind of let it happen. I think that was ultimately the rock bottom part of my time. Because not only did I not care, but I'd come to that realization and was ostensibly fine with it. Fast forward, although not by much, I suppose, about 5 months, I got um, a restaurant job in this area being Davenport, and got an apartment. Um, but at one point, I was coming back from like a more or less like a friend's house. I was close to a block party, um, and on my way back, and a uh, somewhat obviously drunk guy kind of gets in my path. I'm actually just getting ready to cross a bridge, and I was surprisingly sober. But he gets in my path and he kind of blocks me. And I don't even know what the first thing he said was. It was somewhat slurred, probably because of the alcohol. And he, he, I think, two exchanges of words afterwards, he called me a word I really don't like and drew a punch. This is the part that might be a little bit uncomfy to hear. But I ducked under the punch. Oh, I ducked under his second punch. After the first one, I drew a knife, ducked under the second swing, came back up, and I stabbed him in the neck. Obviously, that is what turns into a second-degree murder charge. Um, I would say the headspace I had that night, in general, wasn't terrible. It was definitely still within the realm of not caring what happened to me or what direction my life led, but I would definitely not classify it as inherently terrible so much as indifferent. And at the point that he said what he said and physically swung at me, it was very much like all the anger at things that I should have had, but neglected to due to the indifference that I kind of lived my life in the midst of, just kind of all came out at once. And, obviously I did the thing that I did, and went to jail 3 days later.
And that was like a homophobic attack, basically, right?
Yeah. So the word I guess I don't know if I actually said, he called me a faggot. I'm using the whole word, which is fun. Most people just use the shortened version. So yes, I would say that the attack itself was definitely homophobically motivated, I guess is the way to put it.
And then
And
within how long are you realizing how much of your life has just changed?
well, to be honest, not necessarily immediately. I did not super late afterwards, but definitely not immediately. At the time, honestly, I was still kind of locked into that kind of angry place. Obviously, I realized that there was nothing I could do to fix the situation at hand. So I lunged. I think the day after, I I'd seen it on the news, and let me tell you, that is a heck of a ooh, I don't really know how to describe how that makes some it's surreal, I would definitely say. The best part was seeing, still frames because it was on camera.
Wow.
There was a convenience store not far away that had its CCTV, the little security camera, pointed in roughly the right direction. And so I saw an image of myself from behind my left shoulder on the news. And considering what happened that night, that was kind of an emotional kick in the teeth, I suppose. Definitely a bit of a shock, I suppose. And I think that was the point at which I realized that things are going to happen very rapidly and in ways that would change my life pretty significantly. But a day and a half later, I was arrested, ironically outside of a subway, and by two detectives in a lime green Ford Fiesta. So also pretend did not hurt my feelings. They took me to jail, interrogated me for upwards of 2 hours, which was entirely unnecessary because I pretty much just told them exactly what happened. and they booked me and took me to actual jail. They put me in a jumpsuit and took me to an actual cell.
Mm.
At which point I very much realized that my life had drastically changed.
Mm-hmm. And how does it feel? Because you spent a sec explaining the kind of headspace you're in, and that sounded like an awful headspace where you just don't resist being beaten up because of how you see yourself at that point. Like, what is bringing that headspace to the kind of like my life's just changed in a awful way feel like?
I think at that point, I was still kind of stuck in that slight indifference. I didn't even lie to the police.
Mm.
Like, I literally didn't care enough to have, not that I'm saying people should lie to the police, but under normal circumstances, if you've been caught for a crime, you probably don't want to go to jail. And the way that most people see themselves not going to jail is to lie. I didn't care enough to even lie. Like, I still was very indifferent. Even after getting booked, put in a cell, still very indifferent. Even after the first preliminary hearing, your role, especially if you realize that they are going to get a conviction, is to get the least severe sentence possible, whatever that is. So the first one they said was 60 years. And that was after my bail was already set at $1 million.
Wow.
So I honestly, at that point, just kind of resigned myself to it. I was like, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison. And even at that point, I still felt very indifferent. I would say that it's still not easy to hear that kind of thing. Not necessarily saying, oh, I inherently didn't deserve it, because I'd still done a thing that of its own significance. And so not necessarily saying that I inherently didn't deserve it, but at the time it still comes as even more of a shock. I'd say at that point I pretty much just kind of descended into a depression, I suppose, which breaks through that indifference a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't so much not caring, sum total, it was why care at this point, I guess. I took an open plea of second-degree murder and continued to sentencing,
Mm.
getting 10 years.
And what was that like? What were the conditions like then? What does daily life look like for you?
So it varies wildly depending on the kind of prison you're in. Now, keeping in mind that this is Illinois, their one of their two maximum security prisons, and they've got Stateville and Menards. I actually went to Stateville. There it was, you're in your cell for 24 hours a day. You're let out for an hour, supposed to be let out for an hour. And that's when you do things like take showers, go for walks. You don't have a shower in your cell, obviously, nor enough space to walk. You get to do what limited recreational activities you manage to think of. The rest of the time, you were in your cell, and the cells themselves, especially in Stateville, that prison was built prior to, oh, what's his name? The gangster guy, Al Capone. Now, I don't know if this is true, but supposedly they literally built a tunnel in the basement of this thing just to transfer him back and forth between court. I think that's silly. I don't actually know. And I've never really cared enough to actually find out. I just think if they did it, it's stupid. If they didn't do it, it's a stupid rumor. But that prison is old enough for that rumor to exist.
Got it. Did you feel very different from most of the people there?
You said most? Yes, definitely. I would say that there were two people that I had enough in commonality with that I would say, yeah, those would be the people I would say I had things in common with.
Mm-hmm.
But for the vast majority of them, very little. Now, because of where I lived in DC, I could relate in a lot of ways. That makes any sense. So, obviously, there's even within any given society, you have multiple tiers, so to speak, of socioeconomic status and the kind of, for lack of a better term, subcultures that exist within those socioeconomic tiers. In DC, I basically lived in a project. Because of that, like, I could relate in a lot of ways to people that I had almost nothing else in common with. I think that was probably the thing that I don't want to say saved me, but definitely helped out a lot. Having a common language is exceptionally important. And
And is that about being able to make other people understand you, or you understand people? Is it about like making friends or not
I would say
making
both.
enemies?
Um, well, you really want to start at the baseline of not making
Yeah.
enemies. After that, yeah, I would definitely say that although I couldn't necessarily count a huge number of people as genuine friends, so to speak, there's this phrase in prison, friends over state trays. And the idea is that these are people that you see in the cafeteria. And you probably don't know a whole lot about them, but you're cordial with them, you're polite, and you exchange small talk, which is going to be different from what you do with the other majority of other people in that prison that you probably won't say more than 2 words to during your entire stay. Um, I would say that there were, I think, a few people that I was significantly more friendly with past the state trade stage of friendship. Um, actually knew things about them. They actually knew things about me. Spoke on a fairly regular basis, and genuinely found them pleasant people to be around.
Hmm.
Um, as a gay dude in prison, you it's not so much that you can't make friends. It's more so that it's a bit more difficult. Obviously, we're dealing with a hyper masculine culture, and once again, I would still say honestly for no reason. But it's kind of one of those "it is what it is" things, I suppose. Although I hate that phrase because all it is a concession to bad circumstances. Yeah, you know, um, it is definitely a hypermasculine culture, and one of the things that kind of follows with that is that anything that is seen as not necessarily just different, but anything that is seen as less masculine is inherently ostracized or at least looked down upon. So not only is there a risk to being a gay person in prison, but also an accompanying risk to being friends with one. It's actually a really quick way to lose friends, which I think is in part one of the reasons that made me appreciate the few friends that I did have, because I realize that by being more than a friend over stage rays, that being more than just cordial and polite, that actually having anything over a 10-minute conversation with me, once again, as silly as it may be, hurts their reputation, so to speak. But
But they liked you enough.
because of that, I'm
But
sorry.
they liked you enough to have those conversations.
Yeah, somehow
I get it.
it's my wonderful sense of humor.
Hmm.
And uh, for the most part, the other people in prison still weren't necessarily the worst aspect of prison. It was definitely the conditions in terms of physical, like material conditions, like the walls aren't super insulated, so
Hmm.
winter sucks.
Hmm.
Uh, there's no AC either, so summer isn't fun either.
Hmm.
Um, The food's obviously not going to be super great. It's a prison.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but also the structure, so to speak, the system itself, not as a physical thing, but in terms of the people within it and the way that it works, was, I would say personally, the worst aspect. Incidentally, the reason that I served an additional year was because there was a cell shakedown. Now, I think anyone who's seen Orange is the New Black knows that that means a correctional officer is going to tear your living space apart. But that that is like the least severe version. The not most common, but depending on the kind of prison you're at, a significantly more common thing they do is they do all the cells at the same time, which means pulling everybody out of their cells at the same time, taking them all out en masse, and usually putting them in the cafeteria or something, just somewhere that can actually store that many people, 124, people all at once. And then they proceed to do it all. They tear your living space apart. You'll come back to photos. Now, I didn't have any, but obviously I had cellmates who did. And their photos would be torn in half. And you're allowed to keep food products in your cell if you buy it on commissary, which is kind of like the prison store. And they would actually open unopened food items. For instance, at one point, after tearing one of my cellmates' photos up into little tiny pieces, opening a jar of peanut butter, and then shoving all those pieces into that peanut butter jar. Like, they put extra effort into just being absurdly disrespectful.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason that I stayed an additional year was because during one of those cell shakedowns, they come in and they have like the riot gear on. They pull you out of the cell and they make you face the wall while they handcuff you so they can take everybody out en masse and put them in the cafeteria. One of the things you're not supposed to do is make eye contact. You're not even supposed to look at them. You have to face the wall. And if they see a pupil, you're in trouble. Well, it having been my second cell shakedown, I wasn't inherently expecting that. So he saw a pupil and he proceeded to smash my face directly into the wall that I was attempting mostly to face. That took me by surprise. And I threw an elbow back in the direction of the hand and put it through his face mask. Turns out they don't make them as well as they used to, because it broke it, and he got bits of plastic like stuck in his face. They didn't like that. They were not a fan of that behavior. So 5 additional correctional officers beat me. Threw me to the rounds, handcuffed me, and took me to SEG, which is the actual worst part of prison. The people are terrible, so to speak. Other prisoners aren't inherently terrible, but having to live in those kinds of conditions with that many people is not pleasant. The people who have authority over you are even less pleasant. But SEG, I would say, is the worst. Not only are you now devoid of all people, we are still social animals after all. But depending on what prison you're at, that can also mean not having control over your lights and not having a window. So there's exactly as much light in your cell as they want there to be. For me, that was none. I spent 9 months in almost complete darkness. I mean, like, not being able to read things. The amount of light under the door is almost negligible because the hallway is dim. That has a few effects, I would say. Some of which I still kind of have, although thankfully watches exist. When you don't have the rise and fall of the sun to allow you to measure the passage of time, like you don't know how many days have passed. To this day, I do not know. Um, there were 2 letters I got. I do not know when I got those 2 letters. I could not tell you. I couldn't even tell you what time of day it was. Um, they also do this thing that they stagger meal times in a way that actually disorients you. You expect them to be roughly 8 hours apart. There were a couple of times that they were at most 3 hours apart. Um,
This sounds like torture.
uh, it kind of is, actually, and it also turns out that Illinois is changing that. I didn't know this until exceptionally recently.
Hmm.
Um, but they actually have a bill. I do not yet know if it's passed. I'll probably check today, actually.
And what's in your head at that point when you're going through that? Obviously, nothing was changing externally. What was changing internally?
Uh, one way to put it, I've been stabbed 7 times and took a 38 in the leg, and I would still rather do all 8 of those things again than spend 9 months in seg like that again.
Jesus.
It was genuinely the worst experience of my entire life. Now, once again, I cannot tell you what, I don't have any way of measuring time here, so I can't tell you how long anything took or at what point
Mm.
in that 9 months something happened. All I can give you are my best guesses. The first, I'm gonna go ahead and say probably 2 weeks. I feel like at least within that duration of time, my circadian rhythm probably wasn't all jacked up yet. So if nothing else, just in terms of the amount of times that I, slept and woke up makes me think it was roughly 2 weeks. After the first 2 weeks, you really kind of get hit with the realization that this is gonna be a while, because you know how long they're going to have you there, but there's a difference between in terms of how significant the passage of time is. There's a difference between standing next to a stove and having your hand directly on the stove. The the hand on the stove really makes you think about each second as it passes, because each second definitely carries a little bit more meaning in the form of pain. In this regard, after what I would suspect is the first 2 weeks, I realize very much that this is going to be terrible. But I don't necessarily view it as something I can't get through. It'll be fine, right? It's gonna suck, but humans have dealt with worse. It's gonna be okay. After right at I would say probably 2 months. Actually, at this point, I think I'd gotten 1 letter. I still didn't know what it meant, what it actually said, because I couldn't read it, but it was a thick piece of paper, roughly envelope
Oh
shaped.
my god.
So I felt I could reasonably believe I'd gotten a letter.
Hmm.
Um, you start to realize I've been in here a while. Have they forgotten about me? Like, am I going to be here for like the rest of my sentence? Because they can just arbitrarily, well, at least they used to, they could just kind of arbitrarily decide that. There was no means of recourse. You couldn't go to anyone because nobody's coming to you. You haven't seen a human being in 2 months. To be frank, you haven't seen yourself in 2 months. Uh, at about, I would say, I would say 3 months, that possibility had solidified itself in my brain. And I would say that that was definitely a second rock bottom, uh, at least in terms of emotionally. At that moment, I'd Well, I probably started to go crazy, like in the clinical sense, not just like the colloquial sense. Um, I'd started jumping at small sounds, uh, even even started to wonder if those sounds were real, as wild as that might sound. Uh, for the most part, it was kind of akin to the opposite of hallucination. So, if you're having a hallucination, it's your brain basically putting things in your environment that aren't real. In this scenario, there were, I think, in retrospect, real things in my environment that I began to question. Did I hear somebody beat around a wall 3 cells down for like 10 minutes straight, or did I make that up? Was that real? Um, I I genuinely began to fall apart mentally.
Mm.
And I kind of went through this thing that I questioned literally every decision I had ever made that I could even remember. Um, some of which probably with good reason,
Yeah.
if I'm being honest. But there's a difference between like questioning, oh, should I have done something that was of consequence? For instance, taking that particular route that night. Um, versus like even minuscule things. Uh, I think at one point, and keeping in mind, of course, that I was not in the best mental state.
Yeah, that's a bit hard to forget at this point, I would say.
Yeah. I think at one point I literally questioned whether I should have watched the TV show. And it had nothing to do with anything. Like it was like SpongeBob or some nonsense. Had literally nothing to do with anything. But my brain had gotten to that extent that it began to question the most minuscule things. And at that point, I also began to have genuine fear, which for a while was not a thing I felt super often. Not genuine fear. Um, I would actually equate it almost to something I can only describe as anguish, almost like an angry sadness. That even right now, I do not know how to put into words. Um, I it was probably it was probably at that point that that I like genuinely uh debated over like ending my own life. Like seriously, like genuinely thought about it. I still had a shirt, and I at one point debated over finding some way to tie it to the base of the sink because we still have the sink in our cell. I would occasionally hit the button just to remind myself that sounds exist. But I debated very seriously over time one ended it to the faucet. And you can probably guess, where that's going.
How is this all kind of like fitting into the headspace that you arrived in prison at with that deep despondency and depression? How is both this time in Seg and the wider time in prison overlapping, changing the place that you
Um,
arrived at prison in?
I would say the headspace I was in at prison was basically just not caring a whole lot about what happened to me. Once again, what happened to me, the direction my life went. And I would say, honestly, that interactions I'd had with other people in prison who, at least in a lot of ways, had at least similar life experiences, right? Um, I think that was the first thing that made me think maybe I'm not as worthless as I thought because I like this person sitting across from me. We've been equally worthless. If I can like him, then I must be at least not the most unlikable thing in existence. Like there has to be something there. it's it's almost like the most inadvertent way of discovering that you're still a human being.
Mm.
This shape that moves around and talks in front of me is a human being,
Mm.
but it's also very similar to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I am a human being.
Mm.
Um, but it was at that point that I would say my headspace got definitely better. Probably still not amazing,
Mm.
um, but definitely better. I started to recognize, I guess, that uh, I would say it was kind of like a preemptive realization of something that actually my partner tells me on a honestly exceptionally regular basis. Um, we are all more than the worst things we have ever done. At that moment, I'd kind of realized that this person who is sitting across from me, who has done at least some of the terrible things that I have, if I can manage to not hate him, then maybe I'm not as hateable as I'd thought I was. Maybe the things that I'd thought about myself weren't as true as I'd thought.
Mm.
Um, I think that's one of the things that empathy can really give us more than anything else is not just the ability to understand another person, but an ability to understand who we personally are by understanding that other person.
Mm-hmm. I think being in your own head is a tremendously dangerous thing, and
Oh yeah.
it was definitely the moments where, in situation that feels quite quite different than yours, but similar in some ways. That was the thing that always allowed me to see my own kind of immovable value in the world, was
Mhm,
being around people and feeling appreciated by people and appreciating other people, exactly like you say.
mhm.
Was lots of that, was your sexuality a big part of how you saw yourself and how you saw society seeing you?
I would say that it was one of the things that made me distrust society and also gave me the very negative self-worth. Um, one of the things that I think I'll remember probably until the day I die was sitting in a church. Now, I'm not a particularly religious person now, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I was particularly religious beforehand either. But, uh, like, if you're 8 years old, you're not religious, you're religious on accident, I guess, because you haven't necessarily your brain has not necessarily developed quite enough to understand the exceptionally expansive concepts that most religions almost kind of require you to.
Mm.
Um, um, to an 8-year-old, somebody dying for somebody else's sins is at best an abstract. Um, but sitting in this church, it was a Catholic one, and they do the whole catechism, and they gotta use some verses for that. One of them happened to be Leviticus, and not just any Leviticus. Leviticus, I think it's 18:22. So there's two versions, obviously, of this verse. Most people use the less spicy version. We didn't get the less spicy version. It was, everyone will know it regardless, but just, you know, uh, man shall not lie with another man as with a woman, for it is an abomination. Uh, Surely they shall both be put to death, their own blood be upon their heads. Basically, they messed up. It's their fault. That second part. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in modern English. And hearing that, at this point, I'd come to a couple of realizations that that verse probably applies to me. And looking around, um, seeing people nod and be in agreement with that, I was like, he just said that we should put people like myself to death. Why are we nodding? Is this a good thing? Are we actually fans of this?
Mm.
I definitely think that probably set a bit of a tone, so to speak, as well as subsequent things. Uh, a lot of a lot of homophobic things that we think happened in the 70s, even the 80s. Last thing we usually think about is Matthew Shepard, but things still happen. When I was 16, incidentally, the reason I left school was because after school, walking home, I was jumped. I'm really good at getting jumped. It's nice to have a skill. I was jumped by 5 people, 3 of which I'd actually known from school, 2 of which I did not. I had 3 broken ribs, and at the end of it, they held me down, tore my shirt, and then carved the word fag into my chest.
Oh, that's horrible.
It's still there. I actually showed it in open court. You haven't lived until you've removed your shirt in an open court.
Wow.
Ugh.
I would want to say how incredible it is that you can exude the energy that you do about life, given what's happened to you,
Um,
given how both individual humans and institutions have treated you. I think it's a real testament to you. I think, yeah, it's incredible.
and it's one of the things that I think kept me from completely losing my mind in SAG, and has definitely kept me, I don't want to say in better spirits, but kept me from devolving into the worst possible mindsets, the worst possible headspaces. Is that at this point, I can't have a worse day. Like, as wild as that sounds, if somebody at work is like, "Oh, today sucks," I'd be like, "Today's not that bad."
No one carved anything into me today.
Absolutely. See, there's always what's the song from the Life of Brian? Always gonna look on the bright side of life.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Insult super seriously anymore.
Mm.
When I was in prison, I got hate mail, which is surprisingly
Wow.
common. I would not have guessed, but if you've been on the news 9 times with the back of your head on it for a day and a half, I guess, and then your face for an additional 8 times, uh, people send you hate mail. uh, and it was a lot of people. I got 14 letters, I want to say, in all.
Oh my God.
And it was a lot of things kind of ranging from he should have killed you first, and you shouldn't have even been born. To send a letter to somebody in prison, you can't just know their name. You have to know what prison they're at. You have to know their inmate number. You even, depending on what prison it is, might even have to know their cell house.
Mm.
And you also have to not put anything super terrible in the letter, else it's not going to get to the inmate. You can't have any kind of like personal information of your own. So there's a lot of restrictions on mail. If somebody who might dislike me for whatever reason, I'm not saying that I'm the most lovable person on the face of this planet. After all, I realize what kind of sense of humor I have. But if you're not willing to look me up, look up what prison I'm at, find out my inmate number, and then send a letter that meets all of those restrictions. If you're not willing to do any of that, you haven't tried hard enough to insult somebody.
Mm.
Because talk about putting a lot of effort into it. Like, I feel like anything that's just said out loud, I just cannot take seriously anymore.
That's
Like,
an
man,
effort
at
in.
least you didn't handwrite this.
Yeah. Oh my God. But at the same time, you do. I don't know. We didn't speak about it a heap yet, but I have the sense that you feel a stake in life, in humanity. You feel like optimistic for this like humanity project we have going on somehow.
Absolutely. I So because of events in my life that made me very much distrust, honestly, people in general, and gave me such little self-worth, because of that, I wasn't a huge fan of people in general. But somebody who I am a huge fan of. Um, and I would say that more than anything has been the hugest factor in why I'm not just as much of an a-hole today as I was 12 plus years ago, actually.
Mm,
Um,
that's
I would say
amazing.
that that is what has kind of renewed not only my sense of self-worth. It's the same person, incidentally, who keeps telling me that the world more than our worst mistakes or the worst things we've ever done. Which he stole that phrase, but he's still willing to drill it into me every day, so I'm still thrilled. Um, and I think that is that in meeting people who I could recognize, even according to my, at the time, pretty jacked up worldview, who I could still recognize as, in my own opinion, good people. I'm not even talking about like somebody else who's got all the empathy in the world. I mean, somebody who genuinely did not like people, but it did like them. So that just has to show that even these people that the average person might have written off can't be that bad, at least to myself. I think that ultimately was one of the things that actually led me to recognize that not only is society not, well, it's not great, but it's not nearly as terrible as I'd made it out to be. But also that it can get better.
Mm,
Two of the people that I'd met um, had been in not the exact same, because no two people's lives are exactly the same regardless. Um, they'd had similar life experiences. We'll put it that way. They'd had similar life experiences. Um, and they'd still managed to find some small corner of happiness in a prison. If they can do it, then what excuse do I have not to?
mm. Was there a moment where you remember having that thought? Was it clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, genuine laughter is not super common in prison. Genuine laughter. I mean, out of actual happiness. You don't get derisive laughter if somebody insults somebody else in a particularly funny way. I remember seeing somebody get a commissary stuff is mostly just like pastries and nonsense, like snack foods. And somebody was slapped across the face with a honey bun, which is the most absurd thing I have ever seen.
That was the moment your faith in humanity was restored.
Yeah, that's what it was
Yeah,
rekindled.
yeah.
Well, the which followed that was derisive laughter. It wasn't cheerful. It wasn't happy. It was somebody else got hit with a little Debbie honey bun. You know, not a whole lot of, yeah. Um, I was of all things playing Dungeons and Dragons because it's prison. You don't have video games, and I also really like Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, I should not be telling on myself like this. But I forget what was even said. But the guy who was sitting not directly across, but across slightly to my left, laughed in a genuine way, like out of actual joy. It wasn't how somebody else got insulted or hit with a honey bun or a brownie, but it was out of genuine happiness. And it was at that moment actually that I'd realized, and this is one of the people who had probably the most in common with my own life experiences of anyone I'd ever met. And if they can laugh like that and not just be content in their existence, but actually be, even for the 5 to 10 seconds that that laugh actually lasted, they can find actual happiness in it, then what excuse did I have?
Mm.
One of my favorite, and I'm not going to do an amazing job of quoting it. And to be frank, it's from a comic book, but one of my favorite quotes, like in existence, is it's okay to feel lost. But any feeling of loss that is not accompanied by a plan or attempt to change something to make one's own life better is just functionally useless. Too often, we wear our despondency, our negative emotions, almost as though they're a comfortable shirt. And I think that was ultimately true for myself. I had assimilated myself to that feeling of indifference, of not caring, of no self worth, basically just being sad and angry all the time. And not only was that like the most low effort way of living, but it didn't do myself or the people around me justice.
Mm. Mm.
um, but I'd realized that by just constantly being like a life suck, so to speak, that I was being just as hurtful to those around me. And not just in the way of, things that you do to end up in prison, and to which that would have still been a contributing factor, but also in just the person to person interactions we have every day.
Mm.
I'd realized that the happiness that somebody else's happiness gave me was the exact opposite of what I was giving other people. And
Mm.
it honestly made me appreciate the friendships I had even more
Mm.
because they weren't getting a happy one.
Mm-hmm.
They were getting life suck Ryan, and we're still kind of, trooping through it.
Yeah.
Got to give them a lot of credit for that.
Mm. And does it feel confusing to think about because I mean, I'm sure you're happy to have made that revelation and to understand your life in that context. How do you feel about this situation that brought about something that's been so valuable and changed the rest of your life in such a positive way?
And we are the sum of our entire existence. I think that's one of the things that I'd realized, although I came to the, you know, when you arrive at the right answer through the wrong means. One of the things I realized when I was questioning every individual action I'd ever made when I was in seg, losing our mind, um, the the basis of that logic, I would say, is still true. Had any one individual element of my life been any different, we might not be having this conversation. I might not have ever gone to prison. I may have died in 50 different ways, may have lived in 50 additional different ways. I I feel as though regret is a non-productive emotion. I think remorse is a very productive emotion. Regret just leads you to questioning things like all of the things that you've ever done. So short term, I'm sure it's fun. But in terms of long term, you should probably stick to remorse. Um, it just leads you down this rabbit hole of what if I had done this different? Maybe I could have just walked a different direction that night. But then again, why was I even out? Maybe I could have just stayed home. Maybe I could have just not moved to Davenport. Maybe I could have just never ended up at my father's house. Maybe I could have, and we just end up all the way at what if I wasn't born, which is the exact opposite of what we should be going for.
Mm.
I think that I had to have that absolutely terrible headspace to have the good one I do now.
And what of the institution and what do you think about prison as an institution and the prisons you were in and the basically the torture that you underwent and the humiliation and degradation that like taxpayer dollars went to
Yeah.
facilitate?
Well, I would say that I am a better person now and that prison contributed to that, I would not say that prison is built in a way to contribute to that.
Mm.
It is my opinion, having met some of what society would call the absolute worst people. And I do mean that very literally. Uh, I have actually known and had conversations with actual serial killers, with three of them. I have spent time around in the midst and amongst and murderers, rapists, perpetrators of the worst crimes imaginable, at least on small scales, right? I would say that any of them who turn out better do not turn out better because of prison, but despite prison. And if you're in a survival situation, like your car crashes and you're like upwards of 300 miles away from the closest source of water, there's this thing that people think happens that you get to drink your own urine and it helps you. It doesn't. It actually has, I want to say 3 times, but don't quote me on that. And typical body saline, which means that it will dehydrate you 3 times faster than not doing it. Prison is very much like that. When you survive after drinking your own urine out in the wild for 3.5 months, you don't survive because of it. You survived in spite of it. People who get better in prison, I do not believe, do so because of prison. I believe they get better in spite of it, because all of the things that happened in prison did not require prison to be there to happen. All of the things that the prison itself contributed were incredibly unhelpful.
Mm.
Put it that way. They're the things that make it so I still can't not measure the passage of time without some level of external influence. I have to look at a watch. I'd have to watch something moving to recognize that time has passed. If you were to ask me how much time we've spent having this conversation, obviously I'm not currently looking at my watch. I cannot tell you. I
Mm.
couldn't even put you in a ballpark. It could have been 30 minutes, could have been an hour. I just realized it.
Yeah,
It says it right on the screen, and then, ay, ay, ay. I could not have told you that. So there
Yeah.
you go.
Well, I have to say you were sounding pretty grounded and reflected until you pulled out that drinking urine pee metaphor. But apart from that, I think everything you said makes a lot of sense. And I guess people who listen will probably be interested. Like, what do you see obvious ways that facilitating that process could be improved?
Well, we often treat people who go to prison, regardless of what the crime is for, we just kind of write them off.
Mm.
And the hilarious thing is, some of them will get out of prison. This will be a person who is back in your society.
Mm.
If you cannot see any level of humanity in that person now, when they get out, they will have no humanity for you either.
Mm.
And it won't inherently be, I mean, obviously personal accountability still exists, but it would make me really hard to blame them too much.
Mm.
When you've been written off, when life seems as though it's some kind of contest that nobody is winning and the only people slightly further ahead of you are using cheat codes, what
Mm.
options do you have? And that is how you establish a higher recidivism rate.
Mm. And it sounds, you mentioned kind of briefly, but I could tell it was a massive part of you being able to lead the life you do now and having the attitude that you do. But it's like, it was love, a lot of that, right?
Mhm. Absolutely.
Do you think that love could come from anywhere else apart from a partner, or?
The reason it came from my partner is purely because it did.
Mm.
That's not inherently dependent on. He said the things he was saying before anything actually turned remotely close to romantic. He would have said the exact same thing to Anybody else, actually. The 3 serial killers that I have met, he would have said the same things to.
Mm.
Those same 3 serial killers could also hear from prison.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, just maybe, granted, they're probably not getting out. But people who have done things that they obviously are proud of, if they were to hear the same thing, then I think we might actually have not just a lower recidivism rate, but a lot of happier people, not just the people
Mm.
getting out of prison, but the people who will eventually be around them.
Mm.
Because just as much as I was a life suck on others, they can be too. If nothing else, society should just have some element of self-preservation and try to make the people who are currently in prison actual better people, not just keep them corralled for anywhere between 1 to 20 years, but actually do something to help them, to give them the tools it takes to make oneself a better person.
Mm.
While I do give my partner a lot of credit for the influence he's had on me, it still takes a lot of the personal decision making to not continue to be that person.
Mm-hmm.
If we could give everyone who is currently sitting in a cell, not just in the US, I don't know what other prison systems look like or how much of this they might already have. But if we could just do the exact same thing for everybody, having met those people myself and talked to them and heard the way that they think about themselves and the things that they have done, can just about guarantee you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we would have significantly better people re-entering society, happier,
Mm.
and it would lead to a better functioning society.
Mm-hmm.
We could do that while we have for-profit prisons, but
Yeah.
one thing at a time, I guess.
Would it be fair to call that kind of like the prison should love the prisoners more somehow? Am I trying to tangle too many? Am I trying to?
No, I think that's absolutely brilliant. You always hear about this so-called 3 kinds of love, right? Not Catholic enough for this, but I'm going to try. Eros is romantic. It's the way one feels towards a partner. Platonic is the way one feels towards a friend. Agape is the way one feels towards everyone. I think that if we want a better society, that last one is probably the most important because that is how we care about other people on a fundamental level. I think that if prison was built out of that as its basic principle, that we would have generally less crime because we would have less people with the mindset to do crime.
Mm-hmm.
It would just be happier. It would just be genuinely better overall.
Yeah.
And I think that should be the case.
Mm-hmm. Do you live with more love in your life now, would you say?
I would say I lived with more actual love in my life, both from me to others and reciprocal, than I ever have at any point in my life.
Mm.
I'm counting like since birth.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. I'm so happy for the very strange journey you took together, but that's a beautiful place to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a place I'm pretty thrilled about myself.
Mm.
And honestly, the most differing factor between now and before is the fact that I'm thrilled about anything, but I am. And the thing I'm thrilled about also happens to be a positive thing.
100%. It's been so nice talking to you, Ryan. It's been a really beautiful conversation, and I really love how you see the world and the words you use to describe it as well, and the stories.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it's been really, really nice. Thanks for listening to The Mirror in My Cell. Consider sharing or subscribing to catch the thrice monthly conversations. Thanks.